Evening.
Good evening. Oh, sorry.
I wonder if that started itself or not, or if it just. Good evening. Oh man, that one's awful. Good evening. Well, probably should just get into it at this rate. We'll be picking up from last time, which would be 3-ish weeks ago, where we were setting up the idea. We opened up the idea of transmission being the third part of the chain of things. You start with inspiration. We talked about that. It's from God. God is the source and so forth. Canonization, which of the manuscripts were the ones that belonged. And transmission is the process from getting it from an autograph, which would be what the inspired writers, 40 of which about were the particular authors, and bring it down the line. And we kind of set up the notion of that over time. Tonight we're going to be looking at Old Testament manuscripts, and this is going to be a very cursory overview. You could get into the weeds with this, trying to keep it light. Next week should be New Testament ones, of which I'll have more knowledge of, and there's just generally more information of, but it'll be good. And then we probably do a week on textual criticism and start moving into translations. So, to set it up, the greatest strength behind the Old Testament manuscripts is the commitment of the scribes entrusted with their care. Basically, we're going to find, and I mentioned this before, I reiterate a lot mainly because we have these gaps. With the Old Testament, your advantage isn't going to be coming from quantity, it's going to be coming from quality in terms of how committed the particular scribes were to making sure they got as perfect a product as they could. Whereas on the flip side with the New Testament, whereas they weren't necessarily of poor quality, there's so many of them quantity-wise and made so in such a short period of time, that's going to be its major advantage. And they both have their purposes. So the greatest strength is that there are very few, in comparison with the New Testament, Old Testament manuscripts that we still have. That is just the case. There are thousands of New Testament ones. There are not near that as many old. And most of them, most of the copies, extant copies, existing copies of the Old Testament that we have are no older than about the 10th century AD, which at first might seem like, whoa, because that's like a 3,000-year gap. Well, no, 2,500-year gap from Moses. However, it's not as big a deal as it might seem. And it's going to come about because of an event that happened in 1947 that reaffirmed a lot of things. You might guess that's the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we'll kind of wrap with that. It's all going to tie together. What we're going to find is that these scribes, we're going to have to look at kind of the background of them. And the scribe is just going to be a term for someone who dedicated their life to writing. So they were taught written language, and they cared for the scrolls, cared for those particular things. It was their life, typically. And they had many advantages that the New Testament copyists or their scribes did not. The New Testament was a lot of times copies were made under duress, under persecution, with pressure. With the Old Testament, many times they had a controlled environment with others there to assist them with more careful focus. Not always, but most of the time. So we're just going to kind of go through a little timeline here, and then we'll get into looking at some things. Starts with the early Mosaic period, and that's loosely from about 1500 to 600 BC. We'll say from when Moses starts with Genesis to about the time they go into captivity. We don't really have a whole lot of knowledge in terms of the hows, of how they particularly handled these particular things in detail, because they didn't record those methodologies, but we do know biblically it states that they kept the scrolls with the Ark of the Covenant once it was made, which would have been after, because he's recording all of that. So with the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle, or with the temple? Generally a good thing. It's a good place to keep a lot of these things. Did they have other copies that they used for other purposes? Certainly, but there was always a good copy there. Of course, when they forget about the Bible and actually discover it one day when they went in the temple and like, hey, there's all these old scrolls in here. Who knew? It's sad. It's a sad commentary on where they were as a people, but they were still there and still readable. And that covers a large period of time. We do know some more from when they came out of the exile and then in between the Testaments and then after Christ in the first century and then how they kind of continued on with this. And it's going to come down to, this is kind of a difficult topic to kind of talk about in some ways because we're going to be talking about men who had a dedication to keeping the Old Testament text, who themselves, because of that role and continuing in that role, had rejected the New Covenant and the New Testament. But we still will benefit from the studious work they did on keeping the text alive, even if they weren't following it, if that makes sense. I'm trying to put this in as non-confrontational terms as possible, but really it's just you're going to be dealing with passing over the time they should have been moving on, but we as a side benefit will benefit from their dedication. When they came back from the exile, the picture there is actually depicting the destruction of Jerusalem and them being taken. When they came back, there were a number of things that had to happen. We've been in Minor Prophets talking about that, right? They had to rebuild the wall, right? That's in Nehemiah. They had to rebuild the temple. They rebuilt a lot of their own houses and stuff first, which they shouldn't do. They had to kind of rebuild Jerusalem, reestablish a lot of things. But something else they had to do, and that's in Ezra and also in Nehemiah 7, they had to rededicate themselves to the law. Now maybe I'll just ask why. Why did they have to rededicate themselves to the law? Maybe I'll just ask it that way. Do you know what? They didn't know what it was. They weren't following it. They had taken foreign wives and had to put them away, which is a big thing. They had to recommit themselves. Here's the thing. Many of them in Babylonian captivity forgot over 70 years, and more than 70 years for some of them if they're from the north. Over generations, they had forgotten the Hebrew language. They were speaking Aramaic.
They'd also been taught in the Babylonian culture about their gods.
That is true. They had been influenced heavily there. The Babylonians were really smart in an evil way about moving people to a thing and then integrating them, and it destroys their culture. That's the big fight that's in Daniel chapter 1, trying to get him to eat meat he shouldn't, to embrace things that he shouldn't. And many of the other men that were there, Daniel and his friends not, but they did. They gave into that, and they just became Babylonian in culture, basically. They're created kind of this weird schism of a mix of the two. Well, they come back to the land. All they know is the Babylonian way of doing things. This is God's people. How then are they supposed to teach the people what to do if they don't understand Hebrew? How do they do that? Okay, learn it from somebody who knows. Who's going to know? The priests and the scribes. In Nehemiah, they'll basically be sitting there recounting it, and it talks about how they will, on the fly, orally translate it from Hebrew into Aramaic. What we have then is a very first example in a very specific way, and it probably came about in other narrow times as well before, but when we have the recollection of a translation, a necessary translation. Now it's more on the fly, oral. They would write some of those things down into what were known as the Targums. They weren't a complete, that's there. During this time, the Old Testament books and the entire Old Testament eventually were translated into Aramaic. The Aramaic Targums were more limited to just the law and the things they needed to know. But then over time, because of various reasons, there was a big world pressure with the Greeks when they ruled the world, especially at Alexandria, to collect all the world's knowledge. That's the great library that was there and all of that. And along with everything else, the Old Testament, or Bible at the time, was taken in and translated as well. And that brought a Greek, Koine, common Greek translation of the Old Testament that was known as the Septuagint. Kind of a mouthful. It literally just means the 70. And you're like, okay. When you see it abbreviated and referenced in things, it'll be LXX, 70 in Roman numerals. Where did that come from? Well, there was a legend that 70 or 72, depending on the source, scribes went into differing rooms and did different pieces of it at the same time and then came back together to do it. How true that is, that was the legend. So what you have now is translation. We're kind of opening the door to that, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. The thing about a translation is they're not perfect. The Old Testament Bible that most of those in the first century in Jesus' day will quote from is the Septuagint. They'll quote from it in Greek. Errors and all, interestingly enough. The thing was, the errors were so minute, there was nothing of doctrinal significance. That's kind of an affirmation to us that you can have a translation and know enough to get by, and then if you have questions, you can go back to the original. Jesus could use an imperfect way to communicate things from a source, and it's fine. So there's that. But they were working on that. Scribes were employed for the purpose of making authentic copies for use in various synagogues as well. The synagogue system seems to have appeared in the exile during Babylonian captivity. We don't have the specific date and time and exactly, but it seemed that when they were in captivity, they didn't have the temple anymore to draw them together, nor did they have whatever community centers they would have in their cities, like at the city wall or so forth, or the city gate. Whatever was common in the time, they were moved away. So they created a system of gatherings. Synagogue literally just means to gather together, a gathering. Synagogue, gather around, I believe. I mentioned before that James, in his letter, the word we translate as church is actually synagogue instead of ecclesia, synagogue. So it was a gathering point, and they carried that idea back with them. This didn't mean that they were replacements for temple worship, which is a point of contention. They were just simply gathering places for regular study, encouragement, edification. They had certain rules. You had to have a certain number of families in the town, I think it was 10 or 20, before you could have one, which is why there wasn't one in Philippi. Anyway, all those things. The problem is, if you have all these scrolls at the temple, okay, you can make a few for use for the priests there, especially on high days like Passover and all these different things. But if you start having synagogues in different cities and communities around, well, then how do they read from the scrolls? You got to have copies, right? Those copies would still be in Hebrew. Those would be the same ones that they would sit down to read in Luke 4 in Nazareth when Jesus starts his ministry by walking in. And he was his turn to read, and he read from the scroll of Isaiah and said, "This is now fulfilled in your hearing." It would have been one of those scrolls that had been a copy from a source. What source? Another copy. But that's what they were commonly used. And we think, okay. Well, we get it. We have a Xerox machine. Yeah, right? Oh, okay. Xerox is a company name. We have a copy machine. But of course, they didn't have movable type. It was all hand done. Even when Gutenberg came around, movable type had errors. The early printings of the King James we'll find had some errors, some funny ones, actually. So as we move along, in about 400 to 500 AD, I didn't close that, the Talmudic period, there were a lot of commentaries upon the Old Testament and oral traditions that had come about over time largely by the Pharisees and all of their stuff. They're kind of building a new kind of form of religion of their own. It's not really the old law, but that's whatever. And when they start writing all these commentaries, they start collecting them into volumes and writing them down instead of just relying upon oral tradition all the time. The side effect of that is they also quote from the Old Testament a whole bunch, and so they start having a bunch of quotes in those things, and they want to have good copies of them to quote from. So they, in their communities, in different places, they're continuing this process. Process that was started before, they're maintaining it with the same degree of attention to detail. Throughout the years, Roman Empire falls, Europe goes into upheaval, all kinds of things are happening. In the meantime, they're just tootling along doing this in different communities. And the strict rules of precision the scribes had followed before this era continued on. They followed this really, really strict system. And it led to the Masoretes, which are kind of the focus, mainly because we know the most about them from stuff that we've found of how serious, the methodologies they used in terms of how they copied, how they made copies. Well, I'm trying to give kind of a thread back to the Old Testament here to show that it was born into thing, and these were kind of things they were doing the entire time. And by this point was it was the most serious thing to them in their lives. And we'll see just how particular they were. The Masoretes were a group of Jewish scholars lived between about 500 to 950 AD, and they used strict rules for the scribes. And it is from a lot of their works that we have still existing stuff. I know there was just kind of a history lesson that went from point A to I was trying to pepper it a little bit, but are we still with me? Okay.
Do we know when the scribes first came about? You know, I think you may have mentioned this in the previous class. When do we know that the scribes first began? What period of time did?
We don't specifically. Logically, it would probably be during. What would make the most sense is probably around the time of David or Solomon at the High Kingdom, because they had a lot of wealth and there were already prophet schools that they were forming. During the time of the judges, for better or for worse, they tended to, well, they forgot, they did what was right in their own eyes. There were always people maintaining these things, especially around the tabernacle. But the tabernacle was kind of this isolated unit a lot of the time, and it moved from a town to another place occasionally. But once it was finally rested in Jerusalem, they conquered the city, and then they built the temple, they had a lot more infrastructure in a set place in that city to start that. So that's a logical, specifically, I don't know, it might just be starting to short or something. Specifically, we don't have anything that's to the nth degree. They start being mentioned in the prophets, and it's around post Solomon and the divided kingdom when they start showing up in the text. Was it before then? I mean, Moses had that skill because he was a writer even back then. Aaron likely did as his mouth, and there were others that they trained. There was always someone taking care of the text. So, I mean, from there on, when it became a formal thing, that's harder to state. I don't know if there was an answer to the question, but that's kind of a guess.
I had always, there's no documentation to reinforce this, but as the Levites were learning to be priests and learning to go through those processes, that they were studying to know the word, to know God's word, and that the tradition or the training to copy it, so that each one would have a copy, so that it could, and that's how they kind of evolved.
It would be logical for the Levites to be men of letters. And again, not every Levite was a priest. Every priest was a Levite, but not every Levite was a priest. There were a lot of the other families that weren't of the family of Aaron that were in charge of caring for the tabernacle, later the temple and all its parts, especially when they were moving around, but then once it's set. But there were a lot of them. That didn't take up every day of their lives. They also had they didn't have an inheritance of their own. Instead, they had different cities where they lived and worked, and they were charged with teaching the people. So that would be logical that they would at least, if not being formally copying the whole text, they would understand how to copy pieces of it. And certain pieces became very, very, very popular to copy, the Shema being one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God. That was a text they would roll up and put in little phylacteries and wear in little things on their foreheads, because God said, take this word and put it on your forehead, write it on your forehead, so they took it literally. Anyway, let's get into the rules here. All right, this isn't the nth degree list. I'm just trying to give you a taste of what it would be like to be a scribe. Now remember, you are probably in the more formal settings, possibly in a room with a dozen other people, working with candlelight. It could be one-on-one, but if it was something that they were creating, logically they would have a shelf life, as it were, a use life for their scrolls. And when they were starting to reach a certain point, they'd know they'd need a new one for this particular synagogue to use, and especially for official use. So you're going through the process. And they're going to work on these scrolls a book at a time, maybe. That's why we have 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, 1 Kings and 2 Kings. Because those are not separated in the Hebrew Old Testament, there's a thought that they were so long that they broke those into 2 scrolls. So you start. Okay. Now you have your master. Let's put it, well, actually, we're going to put our master on, because we're writing left to right, too, which is interesting, because still, even then, most people were right-handed, but they're doing it with a quill and ink and trying not to make a mess, and they're using very flourished lettering, because that's what Hebrew is like. You couldn't write a word or a letter from memory. It would be incredibly tempting. But imagine, okay, I have this, these aren't the same thing, but I have this sentence here. History of Jewish scribes. I'm going to copy that over. How tempting would it be to know? Okay, I look at it, I know what it is. History. No, I can't write history. Okay, fine. Well, I know how to spell history, so nope. You start with H, I, S, T. Get the idea? All the way through the text. Now why? Why not commit anything to memory? Yeah, you can conflate it, you can cause. We're going to see when we look into textual criticism, common errors that do creep up are things like ditography. That's a fun word. You know the word you say ditto? Ditography. It literally means to write the same word twice. You can use that. It's fun. It's like, oh, that was a ditography right there. You can sound smart. Letter by letter. There were other methods they had to go through to get the ink wells and various things. But when they came to certain terms and words, when they read from the text, they never said the name of God. They said Adonai, which is Lord. Lord became a replacement word for Jehovah or Yahweh, which is why we carried that tradition over, except in the American Standard where it's Jehovah, ASV of 1901, where you'll have Lord in cap text for the name of God. That's holding over that tradition of not saying his name. Still in our text. Did God command that ever? No. But you can understand at least that they were reverent about it, so it might be a positive. If they came across the word just God, the general term for God, and technically this could apply, this would be specifically referencing him, but the word would apply to idols or false, because it's that term, Elohim. Oh, we've gotten to God here. They would have to reverently wipe the pen in a particular flourishing way before they could start on that one. Okay, now I know I'm coming up on the word Elohim, but now I'm going to forget that it's Elohim. Well, the Hebrew equivalent. The scribe would then have to ceremonially wash his entire body before writing the name of God, which in some of the prophets meant several times because it shows up a lot, showing a reverence for the text. Strict rules governed the form of letters. They had different styles of writing letters, just as we do in English. Some people write letters a little different way, especially in cursive. There's a lot of arguments over how to write cursive. Not that anyone does anymore, but I learned Danielian, and he had a tail on everything, whether it made sense or not, a trailing tail. So annoying. But in Hebrew, I was thinking, well, they had a code book. No, it's like you don't, even if this is how you write it at home, you write it our way, so they all look the same. The form had to be a particular shape and size, because they had to fit uniform lines. There's no lined paper here either. You're just going across a parchment with ink. Practice. Not only the form of letters, the space between letters, the width of a hair typically. You can't have too many spacings, because then you might confuse where a word break is. The space between words, the space between headings or sections. There was an entire code book for that, nth degree, all by hand. Here's where it gets fun. They were broken into sheets. Sometimes we get this notion that a scroll is just this continuous line. Well, I haven't met an animal that has skin that doesn't end, and parchment is made of animal skins. So they're broken up into sheets, and they connected them together at certain points. That was part of the finishing process. But when they're working on a sheet, and a sheet could be a good size, one mistake on a sheet condemns the entire sheet. You just got to the end. Aleph, and you draw, whole thing's done. Start over with the sheet. 3 mistakes, you start the whole process over again.
Who was doing the proofreading?
Well, that comes up because you would have a leader. Typically, this is how, and the way I was doing it probably didn't fit every time how they did it. There's different theories as to it, but there's the possibility that since you couldn't do it from memory, someone actually spoke the letters out. But it would be someone that they're interacting with. So either if they caught it themselves, can't lie, or if they're working in a team, they didn't typically do this in a vacuum, is the point. Because they knew every word and every letter, they knew the center point of every scroll. They could tell you what the middle word was in Psalms, the middle letter in Psalms, and they would count them out. And if you had any variation, you're above one word, down a word, up a letter, down a letter, it's done. Scrap it, start over again. When they were learning, I'm sure they did. You probably got good fast, or you didn't do that job anymore. And again, this is by the time, if we're talking about these particular codified letters, we're talking by this time of the Masoretes, after the time of Christ, many years, where they're most likely cloistered away in some back room somewhere, and this is their life. This is all they do. I don't know if with the Levites, again, but they wanted to maintain that text.
That's the thing, the integrity of the copy was on the mind of the copyist.
Yep.
And that self-evaluation and self-maintenance was such a priority. You didn't want to mess up. It's God's word.
Yes. And that's not to take away from the New Testament copyists that they didn't take it seriously, but they also wanted to get those Gospels out fast. And so what you'll find with that is we just have a lot of it. That's going to be its own thing. But yeah, these reverence to these things to the nth degree. So once I go through this whole process, let's say you're doing, let's say the Psalms, which is interesting because that one's going to have section breaks that are unusual because there's 150 of them. They break in certain ways, and then you have the Salah marks that we aren't even sure what they are. Probably music notations, possibly, or some sort of breath, whatever. And they're all in there. Okay, he counts at 3, finds the center word, finds the center letter, counts the whole thing. It's back and forth. It's certified, it's rolled up. They tie it up with a bow. Our new copy of Psalms is ready to be used. This is where we don't have that many existing left. When they had a new one that was certified, they usually destroyed the old one so as to remove confusion. Occasionally, they would feed the old ones down the line to the synagogues. And then when they got used up, they got destroyed. But they didn't want a ratty scroll either. If they got too much damage, too much things, they would reverently typically burn them rather than have God's word look ratty. So with this process of continually making new ones, but they're not exponentially growing out, we don't have a whole bunch that were left. What do we have? Well, some important manuscripts. I'm going to list 5 of them here, and I'm going to be bouncing in and out to another thing that I have with the pictures of them. The first one is the Nash Papyrus. This is one that's actually quite old, somewhere between 200 BC and 100 AD, or AD 100. All it has is one damaged copy of Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God, and so forth, and the Ten Commandments, or 2 fragments of the Ten Commandments. You can imagine the Ten Commandments and that element being very popular. So this may not even have been a commissioned entire Pentateuch or law. It might have just been those pieces that were copied for someone, possibly bought. Typically someone of means wanted those pieces, but not the whole thing for their own use. And around a little before, maybe after Christ, and these are the fragments we have, look like this. So I'm going to zoom them a little bit here. We can see the Hebrew lettering there. Some of those letters are familiar to me. I just can't imagine the edge you need with an ink pen there, where you can have wider cuts and then points, kind of like calligraphy, because they use swipes and little digs for how they write to complete these letters. Orientales 4445. The names can be a little odd. We're going to find this with the New Testament manuscripts especially. Many times they just kind of come down to where either they were discovered or where they happen to be housed now. One of them in the Greek is the Washingtonius. It's because it's in Washington, D.C. And the numbering system kind of came down to how they cataloged them over time. 4445 was a catalog number, and it just stuck to this one. But it has large portions of the Pentateuch, which would be books of Moses, the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And let's get this one on. That's a bit from it. Now on the margin there's some, noticing this one's a little different because on that margin it looks like there's some margin notes. One thing you might also notice, and get the pen here, I don't think they were as much in the other one, but since this is a much later manuscript and this starts to show up a lot, you see these little marks like this, little dots and dashes? Those are breathing marks. They're not definitive in the sense that they're not part of the original text. Hebrew, like many of the languages in the east of its day, Arabic, Aramaic, and a lot of them, has no vowels. So unless you want to go without vowels, they have to be supplied. The vowel sounds were just kind of assumed. You would learn the words at the time, and how does this word sound? And with vowels, you can make things sound very different. Hebrew, again, the pronunciation of the name of God is still not really known. Is it Yahweh? Is it Yahweh? Is it Yehwah? Because they're all vowels and they could all work. Where we get Yahweh from is supplying the vowel sounds for Adonai on top of it. But you can't go to someone and say, well, how is this pronounced? Because they have to have lived then. Over time, these became a shorthand for this is how we pronounce it. Was that the correct way? But that's what those little marks are. The ones over here are more interesting because they seem to be kind of a running commentary or some sort of numbering system, possibly verse structure, even though we didn't break it into verses until much later. So this one's kind of been kind of an open question. We're not entirely quite sure what was going on here because this is the text primarily. But it's interesting that it's there. Okay. No, they're not. They're very tight. They're very tightly spaced. And, well, actually, a number of these are just single words. I mean, this here is one word. And it even has a dash in it. So it's one of those chain names. But this would be a space between words here. Some of these actually look somewhat familiar. This might be Adonai there. I'm not sure. Okay. Then there is Codex Carnesis. It has some of the known as the former prophets, Joshua through Kings, books of history, depending on how you want to lay it down, and the latter prophets, Isaiah through Malachi. That was from about 895. I got a picture of it here. Oh, this is actually a little better one. It has a bit of color to it. Now you can see them across the page now with their sections. So you have a section break here. You've got, like, to the next line, and then these marks down the side, maybe commentaries, maybe aids in where it's supposed to lie. But you're also reading, again, right to left. So you're going that direction. So it's more uniform on the right-hand margin for that reason. Going down. You're going to proceed down and then move to the next line. But it's actually pretty fine work if you get in here of how small some of these letters are. I know it's kind of hard to get an idea of the scale of this thing. It's going to be a little bigger than a sheet of paper, but it's still not going to be much more than this, and it's pretty fine work. The Aleppo Codex contains most of the complete Old Testament. Very similar there. I don't know if I can really focus on too much more there. It's following these different forms. And then I'll just go next one. This is a cover, seeming, or one of the, maybe not a cover, but they would draw very intricate images. And this wasn't limited to the Old Testament. A lot of the medieval writers, with Latin texts later on with the New Testament, they would do this a lot too. They would embolden it with a lot of imagery and various things. And then this is Leningrad. Let me get over to the name of it. Leningradensis, Codex Leningradensis. From AD 1008, it's the oldest existing one we have of the whole thing. And you can get a copy of it in a modern printing. Basically, if you're going to get a Hebrew Old Testament, many times it will be this, the Codex Leningradensis, from where it was once housed. I don't know if it's still there. It's not Leningrad anymore. It's St. Petersburg again, so it might still be there. I'm not sure. But, yeah. Okay. Gave some visuals. But again, we still have that question of 81,008 is still 2,500-ish years removed from Moses, and still 1,400-ish years removed from Malachi. That's a lot of time. The assumption was, even with the best of intentions, that over time, we would have had little things creep in. Okay? And if we ever found anything that was from an earlier time, even it doesn't even have to be from like the time of Moses or from like the time of David or Solomon, just anything earlier than what we had, if we went back around any time, the assumption we'd start to see variances and errors showing up in the text. Then something happened in 1947. Anyone know what happened in 1947? The Dead Sea Scrolls. They basically were found by accident by a shepherd boy. He was out herding, chucking rocks. He was chucking them into a cave, and then he heard something weird when a rock hit something in there. He was hitting clay. Just goofing around. Went in there, lo and behold, there were a lot of these pots and various things that were containing a number of scrolls that were preserved from the elements because of how they happened to be stored, how arid it was, the location, and so forth. Now, they were digging around in different caves in there, finding stuff. They were still finding stuff until 1956. Makes me wonder why it took them 9 years to find some of these things, but these caves were, some of them a bit iffy in terms of safety and time, but they also had to deal with political realities of where they were at in the world at the time and what they could do and where. But they contain writings dated from 250 BC to AD 68. We're fairly certain about AD 68 with a couple of them just because of what it contains. They're not all Old Testament writings. There's a lot of writings in there that are commentaries relating to Old Testament works, especially the ones later on around AD 68 dealing with a lot of the Zealots, the Essenes, we're going to take down the government anti-Roman groups that once there was the rebellion against Rome, fled to fortresses in the various hills, including Masada, and holed up there until they all killed themselves. But a lot of their writings building up to that to get the people, they were about interpretations of various books in the Old Testament, their prophecies about the Messiah, but their interpretation of the Messiah should be clear as this fighting warrior, the forces of light defeating darkness, the forces of light being them and darkness being Rome. Basically, they turned biblical prophecy into their own ends and then convinced people to follow it. They didn't sell it for profit, that's what we do today, but they had their own thing. So it's like, why do we care about some of these weird, crazy prophecies? Because inside these commentaries, they quote from the direct text. And they're quoting from the text of their day, 1,000 years before. So again, what's the assumption? You're going to have some crazy, crazy variants. We could go to the nth degree with this, but really, like I said, these scrolls were expected to show that errors and changes had affected the Old Testament text over the passage of time. The outcome was the complete opposite. A reaffirmation. In terms of any form of literature with that period amount of time passing, even just changes in style of a language should creep in. But Hebrew, kind of like certain other dead languages, kind of got frozen in time. It didn't change a whole lot. But the only things that tended to change perhaps were the names of places and how they were particularly pronounced, or certain names, and even that was still talking about the same figure. Is it Yah or Jah? We have a lot of anglicized names that get tossed into the Bible. Anyway, the core meat didn't change at all. And we're talking over time. I mean, go back and try to read an English work from 1024. 1,000 years back. It's going to be Old English in closer to some crazy German you're not even going to notice. Go back just to the original printing of the King James Bible in 1611 with the weird long F's, S's or F's. And that's normal for language. That's normal for things. This didn't. This got not accidental. One example is the Cave 1 Isaiah scrolls, IQISA, IQISB. The text in them, I could try to bring them up and show. It's like it would be showing you here's Hebrew here and here's Hebrew, and I'll tell you that they match. But what I'll say is they match, okay? Because it's, yeah. A quote from Gleason Archer in a book, A Survey of Old Testament Introduction. It's kind of an introduction to the Old Testament from for lack of a better term, a conservative scholarship, meaning trusting in inspiration and not attacking it perspective, stated in this way: the scrolls proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. Now, 95% is not 100%. You're like, hold on. 95 is really good to begin with. The 5% variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variations in spelling over time. Or, and here's the thing, there wasn't an Oxford Dictionary of Hebrew spelling. Sometimes things were spelled in different ways. Without the codified form book, names could be spelled with a little here and there variance, but it's still talking about the same thing. There's no difference in meaning. And slips of the pen would be where it went a bit long for a shorter thing. And they were written in caves, most likely, when they were hiding away. Not all of them, but that's where they got stored. But a lot of these people were actually hiding in caves when they wrote these things. 1,000 years before what we have. They were expecting a mess. They were expecting to open it up and say, see, we finally have it. We can go against those that believe in the Bible as a whole. We can go to those who are following the Old Testament alone, or whatever. We can just hammer everyone to this stuff because we're going to see here's this, and here's what you have, and they don't match. And guess what? They matched. So we can trust the accuracy of our Old Testament because of the accuracy and reliability of the scribes who transmit it to us, and because of God who did not allow his word to fail through the process of transmission with them. Like I said, with the Old Testament, it's not quantity, it's the extremes they went to ensure quality within human limitations. And even then, they did really, 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 really well. When we look at the New Testament, there are so many of them. And the thing was, we have discovered so many just in the last about 100 and, well, probably by now, like 50 years. Just in the last, like, 150 years. Versus many years before that it just gets insane. Thousands. And we'll kind of pull it all together. Any questions or thoughts on it? I kind of rolled along all these. Either I explained it really well or really badly. All right, well, we'll pick up there with the New Testament next week. Is there anyone that needs partake this evening? Lord's Supper? No? I think there would be. Is there anything that needs mentioned? No meal Wednesday. I don't think we're going to magic up new ones in the next 3 days. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, Charlie, would you close us in prayer?